this is an ethnographic interview. The premise, the idea that I'm getting at is how did a person's experience as an immigrant change some aspect of their culture? Mm-hmm. And there was a couple domains that I could have focused on, but I thought it was really interesting, having known you for so many years and knowing what you're like, that I would like to talk about religion. The domain we'll be focusing on today is religion. So first I have to kind of do some introductory stuff. So how old are you?
Almost 48.
Okay, 48. Mm-hmm. And where is your hometown in Germany?
It's in the northern German plains. It's a small town called Kloppenburg, Kloppenburg, and that's roughly a half an hour from the Dutch border, half an hour from the coast, half an hour from Bremen. So a little triangle there.
So what year did you immigrate to the United States?
Strictly speaking, 1991. That's when I came over as a student. I was in the middle of my undergrad after having done my military service and some college in Germany, and then I came over and came on a student visa. So technically I was an immigrant back then because a student visa is not an immigrant visa, but it became pretty clear pretty quickly that I was probably going to stick around.
And where did you immigrate to?
I went to school and moved to Austin, Texas.
What kind of about your experience here made you want to stick around?
I think that's mostly a matter of just sort of young person's wanderlust more than anything else. And then I just sort of felt more at home at UT than I had at my college in Germany, mm-hmm. and stuck around. And then it just, inertia took over and it became more and more of just the assumed default that, oh, I'll stay here.
Our relationship is that you're my stepdad. You married my mom. And what is your career right now?
So I'm a self-employed IT consultant.
Is your family religious?
Not really. We always sort of considered ourselves Easter and Christmas Catholics. That has maybe expanded a little bit for my parents as they've gotten older. Maybe now it's 4 to 6 times a year mass attendance. Mm-hmm. But I would not consider any of us particularly religious.
You attended Mass occasionally as a kid.
Well, I had a brief period where I attended Mass a little more frequently than the rest of the family because I became an altar boy in like 2nd grade. But that was more of that was what a lot of kids around there did, and there wasn't a whole lot of other stuff going on. It was that or soccer. They had good campouts. So that lasted for about 2 years.
What was your typical day when you were doing your altar boy stuff?
Oh, it was like an hour and a half. You go, you put on the little dress, you do your little job during Mass, and then you go home. Once a week there was like a meeting, and it was all boys. There were no altar girls back then, because Germany's Catholic Church was a little more conservative. And there was sort of an evening get-together, and we were playing games and doing whatever boys in boy groups will do. It was probably no different than it would have been for scouting or any other sort of youth organization, mm-hmm. except on Sundays some of us would go and put on a little dress and do the altar boy thing.
What was a typical German Catholic Mass like?
Well, ever since Vatican II in the 60s, Catholic Masses have been held in local language. So that is really the only way a Catholic Mass in Germany is different than a Catholic Mass anywhere else. Germany, when I grew up in the 70s, was already a fairly secular country. Now, my little region of northern Germany was probably the most Catholic part. While my little town was pretty darn Catholic, sort of my generation, there was a distinct secularism, especially, once you got into the 80s. Now, in Germany, there's a big difference between church membership and church attendance, because by default, the state actually captures your quote-unquote confession. You're registered as Catholic, Lutheran, or other when you're registering your domicile, which you have to do in Germany. That is because the state in Germany actually levies church taxes, which then get remitted to the churches. And that goes back to a rather nasty deal that the churches made with Nazis. As a result, you have lots of people who are officially members of the Catholic Church who never go. Mm-hmm. Because especially in small towns, it would be considered, or would have been considered, a little odd or socially unacceptable to leave the church.
It's interesting the way politics and religion.
Yeah, I think the technical term is weird.
You are more secular than your parents.
Well, for my parents' generation, I wouldn't say that they were deeply religious. People would go to church and they were engaged in the church and they were religious in that sense, but it wasn't a deep spiritual experience for most people. It's just what people did. It was the socially acceptable and expected thing to do. So it was very much a small town, rigid social structure.
It's not a culture that I think exists here in the Pacific Northwest.
Well, I think in most of the U.S., religion, because there is so much variety, people flock to the religion that they are attracted to, that they spiritually feel spoken to. In much of Europe, religion and the state had been intertwined for so long. I mean, if you think about the Church of England, your local sovereign was also dictating which church you were part of. That kind of thing doesn't jive with the American concept of how religion is supposed to work. Overall, I think Americans have, while being more religious and spiritual in general than Europeans, have been less tied into the institutional piece of it.
As I know you, you're not a spiritual or
not in the religious sense. No.
In spiritual, religious sense way.
I think my spirituality is closely tied in with human relationship and with sort of a sense of awe at, big things and little things,
But not necessarily the divine spirituality that we think of in classical stuff.
No.
Like, has that always been the case, or when did you kind of move towards that?
Well, in my upbringing, religion was sort of a cultural background type of thing. They called it the Reichskonkordat, this little contract between the churches and the state. The churches actually would teach what you would think of as Sunday school in public schools. It was always there. There was always instruction and so on and so forth. There was no expectation that, there would be some sort of spiritual revelation. There was, First Communion and confirmation and all those things, but they were really more like social development milestone. There was no model for sort of deeply felt spirituality anywhere. Even German nuns and priests and monks seemed to be fairly sober. So the sort of charismatic spiritual experience, the revivalist preacher, that sort of thing, people speaking in tongues, that's not a very Northern European thing. It's all very subdued. We tend to be very sober people.
Have you been to church or mass in the United States?
Probably less than a half dozen times in these 20-odd years. Skepticism is a big part of what's at the heart of German education. Germany as a country has a history of, when people get too passionate and excited about stuff and don't do a lot of critical thinking, really bad things happen. So that's sort of our recent history. And before that, there was no Germany. There was German culture, but there was no German nation state. Today's German education system spooled back all the way to sort of the German part of the Enlightenment period in terms of values and guiding principles for education. There's a lot of emphasis on challenging assumptions, not taking anything for granted. I would say that is probably a cultural thing for Germany as a whole. I think we all have sort of our things that we find fascinating, that we feel comfortable with, and things that we find a little weird. And for all of us, those boundaries are in different places. One of the things I like about the U.S. is that there just, in general, seems to be a fair amount of tolerance along the lines of, well, this is my thing, that's your thing. It might not be my cup of tea, but I don't really get involved. In Europe, on the other hand, the quote-unquote dominant culture has a much harder time with that sort of divergence. So I find that, that sort of almost enforced homogeneity is something that actually pushed me out of Europe. And when I said I felt a little more comfortable and at home here than I did at home, that is a big part of it. In Germany, everybody's in everybody's business. And that's a very European thing, especially in very heavily populated countries like Germany. Did being exposed to, sort of mysticism or passionate religiosity or spirituality strengthen my convictions? No, not really. There's a temperament issue and there's a background issue, and in my case, they just mesh very nicely. So